Subscribe to my YouTube channel, share it with your friends, and comment your thoughts. The sudden beeping of the heart monitor was the first thing he heard, cutting through the silence like an alarm in the stillness of the hospital room. It was loud, harsh, a stark contrast to the peaceful nothingness he had been floating in. For a moment he thought it was a dream, his mind clinging to the hope that he was still lost in some half-conscious state. But as his eyes fluttered open, they were met with the blinding white light of the sterile hospital room, a room that felt cold, unwelcoming, like an alien world he had no memory of entering. His body felt like it belonged to someone else, heavy, foreign, unresponsive. Every limb was a struggle to move. The weight of his eyelids seemed unbearable as he tried to blink, adjusting to the harshness of the light. His throat burned dry and tight, as though he hadn't used it in weeks. He opened his mouth to speak, but the sound that escaped was barely a whisper. "Water," he croaked. A sharp intake of breath from the corner of the room caught his attention. He tried to turn his head, but the motion sent a wave of dizziness crashing through him. His stomach churned, and for a split second he thought he might be sick. His chest tightened and panic surged through his veins. He had to focus, had to understand what was happening. His eyes swept across the room, but nothing looked familiar. The walls were bare, the floors cold and clinical. And yet, something felt different, a sense of disconnection, like he was caught between two worlds. And then he saw her. She was sitting by his bedside, her hands folded neatly in her lap, staring at him with eyes that seemed both familiar and strange. His breath caught in his throat. Emma. The name escaped his lips, a whisper of disbelief. She didn't move, didn't respond immediately. For a moment he thought he had imagined it. But then her eyes met his, and she gave him a small, reassuring smile. The smile didn't reach her eyes. "Hey," she said softly, her voice laced with something he couldn't quite place. "How are you feeling?" His mind spun. This was impossible. Emma, his ex-wife, the woman he hadn't seen in years, was sitting right there in his hospital room, as if no time had passed, as if they hadn't gone through everything they had, as if their entire history hadn't been marked by bitterness, secrets, and the bitter sting of a failed marriage. "What are you doing here?" he managed to choke out, confusion and a rising sense of fear in his voice. "Why are you here?" She sighed, her fingers twitching slightly as if she were holding something back. She looked at him, her gaze flicking to his hand, which was still, tethered to an IV drip, and then back to his face. "I told you I'd be here," she said, her voice steady, though her lips trembled slightly. "When the accident happened, I was called. I stayed with you." His mind raced. An accident? What accident? His memory was a blur, a maze of fragmented thoughts that didn't fit together. He couldn't remember how he had ended up here. Couldn't remember anything beyond the overwhelming sensation of waking up. There was something off about the whole situation. He blinked again, trying to clear the fog in his mind. "Emma, I don't—" He was about to ask her what had happened, but then the weight of his own confusion hit him like a freight train. His thoughts scattered, his words caught in his throat. "I don't remember anything. What happened?" She nodded slowly, her eyes softening as she looked at him. She reached for the cup of water beside his bed and helped him sit up just enough to take a sip. The cool liquid soothed his throat, but it did nothing to clear the chaos in his head. He wanted answers, needed them. "You were in a coma," she explained quietly, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "It's been weeks after the crash. They didn't think you'd make it." She paused, her voice faltering as she spoke. "I didn't leave, not for a moment." Crash! His head was spinning. Nothing made sense. His thoughts were like a jumbled puzzle, pieces scattered on the floor, all out of order. Crash? What crash? Her face tightened. "You were in a car accident," she said softly. "You don't remember?" He shook his head slowly. The beeping of the monitor seemed louder now, as if it were echoing in his skull. A car accident. But he couldn't picture it, couldn't recall anything that would explain how he had gotten here. How he had ended up in this hospital bed, surrounded by strange machines, with no memory of what had happened. A sudden chill ran down his spine. "Why are you here, Emma?" he asked again, his voice raw. "Why didn't you leave?" She seemed to hesitate for a moment, her fingers twisting in her lap as she looked down, away from him. Because I'm the one who found you," she whispered. "I was the one who pulled you out of the wreckage." The words hit him like a punch. She found him? His mind reeled with the implications. Why was she here? What had really happened in those weeks when he had been unconscious? The questions were piling up, each one more urgent than the last. But none of them could answer the most pressing one. Of all, what was the truth? The first night after his awakening felt like an eternity. Despite the pain in his body, despite the fog in his mind, he couldn't bring himself to sleep. His eyes darted across the room, catching the faint glow of the moon through the hospital window. The quiet hum of the machines around him became his only company, the steady beep of the heart monitor, reminding him of how fragile his existence had become. But it wasn't the machines or the empty room that filled his thoughts. It was Emma. Why had she stayed? He hadn't seen her in years, not since the divorce, since the day she had walked out of his life, taking everything he had ever known with her. Yet here she was, by his side, as if nothing had ever happened, as if time had stood still. Why? His mind kept circling back to that question. He tried to recall the accident, the car crash that had put him in this state, but nothing came. The gaps in his memory were vast, a black hole swallowing everything before the moment he woke up. The only thing he could remember clearly was the empty look on Emma's face when she had told him she had found him, pulled him from the wreckage, and stayed with him through the days of uncertainty. But what was she really hiding? The thought gnawed at him, the suspicion that something deeper, something darker, was unfolding just beyond his reach. But the more he tried to push the questions to the back of his mind, the more they clawed at him, pulling him toward an unknown truth. The next morning, Emma was sitting by his side again, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a quiet calm in her demeanor. She had always been composed, even in the most chaotic situations, but there was something different about her now. She was holding something back, a wall that he couldn't break through. "Emma," he said, his voice still hoarse, but stronger now. "You said you found me. What happened after that?" Her face stiffened at the question. She looked down at the floor for a moment before meeting his gaze. "There's not much to say, honestly. You were in bad shape. The crash was bad. The car was totaled. There was blood everywhere. I don't know how I managed to get you out of there, but I did. And then I called for help. But you stayed," he pressed. "You could have left after I was in the hospital. Why didn't you?" She hesitated, her lips parting as if she were going to say something, but then she closed them again, her eyes darting toward the door. "I made a promise," she said quietly. "I promised I'd be here no matter what." His brow furrowed. A promise? But that didn't make sense. They had been strangers for years, their lives nothing more than a collection of distant memories, each unmarred by the failures of their marriage. "What promise?" he asked, his voice growing louder. "Emma, what aren't you telling me?" For a long moment, she didn't respond. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the glass of water beside him, taking a sip as she avoided his eyes. It was clear she was hiding something, and every second that passed only fueled his desire to know what it was. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was my fault," she said. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. He stared at her, trying to make sense of what she had just said. Her fault? What do you mean, what was your fault? She took a deep breath, her hands clutching the edge of the bed as she gathered her thoughts. The crash, she whispered. It wasn't an accident. The statement hit him like a lightning bolt. His heart skipped a beat. His mind reeled. What? Do you mean it wasn't an accident? He asked, his voice rising with disbelief. Her eyes welled with tears, and she quickly wiped them away. It was intentional. Someone did this to you. To us. His mind raced, trying to process her words. He tried to make sense of it, but nothing added up. The idea that someone had deliberately caused the crash seemed too outrageous, too impossible. But the look on her face, the fear, the guilt, it told him that she wasn't lying. Who? He asked. Who did this? Emma shook her head, the tears falling freely now. I don't know, she sobbed. I swear I don't know. But I think it's someone from your past, someone who wanted you dead. He sat there, stunned, unable to speak. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the walls pressing in as the weight of her revelation settled over him like a thick fog. Someone wanted him dead? But why and who? You're not making sense, Emma, he said finally, his voice shaking. You've got to tell me everything, now. She nodded, taking a deep, shaky breath before she spoke again. The night of the crash, you were being followed. I saw the car behind you. It was the same car that had been trailing you for days before. I think they were waiting for the right moment. They didn't count on me being there, though. They didn't count on me finding you before it was too late. He could barely comprehend what she was saying. A stalker, a hitman. It all felt like some twisted conspiracy, but the sincerity in her voice made him question everything he had ever known. Later that afternoon, Emma left him alone in the room, her departure leaving him with nothing but questions and confusion. His mind was a whirlwind, each new thought pushing out the last until nothing made sense. He needed answers, but where could he start? Who could he trust? And what was the connection between the people from his past and the attempt on his life? As the hours dragged on, a nurse came in to check on him, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't focus on his recovery when the mystery of the crash consumed him. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the pieces didn't fit. Someone had wanted him dead, but why? Suddenly a thought hit him. A memory buried deep in the recesses of his mind began to surface. He remembered faces, names, and situations that seemed too familiar. Old business partners, friends turned enemies, betrayals, deals gone wrong. Could one of them have been behind this? But who? The questions spun in his mind, growing more urgent with every passing second. He had to get to the bottom of this. And he would. The days following Emma's revelation felt like a blur. The hospital room had become both his sanctuary and his prison. The soft hum of the machines around him was a constant reminder of how fragile his existence had become. Yet the most pressing thing on his mind wasn't the road to recovery, nor the physical pain that gripped him every time he moved. It was the question that haunted him day and night. Who had tried to kill him, and why? He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind working overtime to piece together fragments of memories and half-formed thoughts. His life, his past, had always been a whirlwind of ambition, success, and business dealings. But he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that somewhere, in the dark corners of his past, there were people who held grudges that went deeper than he could ever have imagined. As the hours dragged on, he found himself replaying every significant moment in his life, every deal, every betrayal. Names and faces floated in his mind like ghosts, fleeting but impossible to ignore. Some were old friends, some were business partners, and others were enemies, people who had been pushed aside in the cutthroat world he had lived in. But which one of them had wanted him dead? The answer, however, wasn't going to come from his memories alone. He needed to investigate, to dig deeper into the layers of his past that he had long ago buried. The truth was out there, and he was determined to find it. That afternoon, Emma came to visit again. This time, her expression was different. Gone was the calm, composed facade she had worn the previous days. Today, her eyes were bloodshot, her face pale. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, as if the weight of the secret she had shared was too much to bear. "Emma," he said as she walked in, his voice raw from the hours of silence. "We need to talk about everything." She sat down by his bedside, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. She looked at him with a mix of guilt and sorrow, and he could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She hadn't been completely honest with him. He could feel it, and that made him even more determined to get to the bottom of this. "I've been thinking about what you said," he continued, his voice low. "You said someone tried to kill me, but you don't know who did it. You just know they were following me." She nodded slowly. "I'm sorry. I wish I could give you more answers, but I don't know who they are. I just know what I saw." He leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. "What did you see, Emma? You need to tell me everything. There's something I'm not understanding here." For a moment she didn't respond. Her gaze drifted to the window, her mind seemingly miles away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "After I found you in the wreckage, I did what I could to help. But I couldn't stay there forever. I had to call the authorities, get you the help you needed. But when I went back to the crash site later, there was something strange. Someone had been there before me. They had taken the evidence." "The evidence?" He frowned. "What do you mean?" She turned back to him, her eyes wide. "The car, the one that was following you. I found a piece of it at the scene. Something small, a part of the bumper. It wasn't from your car. It was from another vehicle. I couldn't make sense of it at the time, but now I think it's connected to whoever did this to you." He absorbed her words, trying to make sense of them. A piece of the car? It was strange, but it made sense. Someone had deliberately left evidence behind, something to lead them to the truth. "But why? What game were they playing? Did you tell the police?" he asked, his voice rising in frustration. She shook her head. "No, I didn't. I couldn't. I wasn't sure what to think, and I was scared. I didn't want to make things worse." His frustration grew. Scared. She was always the calm one, the rational one. Why hadn't she told the authorities about what she had found? "Emma, we can't keep running from this. We need to go to the police. We need to find out who did this, before they come after us again." She stood up suddenly, pacing back and forth across the room. "I can't. You don't understand. I can't just go to the police. There's something you don't know. Something I've been keeping from you." His heart skipped a beat. Something she hadn't told him. He hadn't even realized that there was more to the story than what she had already shared. "What is it?" he demanded, his patience wearing thin. "What are you not telling me?" She stopped in her tracks, her hands shaking at her sides. "It's not just about you, okay? It's about me, about us, the crash, everything. It's connected to a decision I made a long time ago." He stared at her, his confusion growing. "What do you mean? What decision?" She took a deep breath, her face contorting with emotion. "You have to understand. I didn't want this to happen. I didn't want you to get hurt, but I didn't have a choice. The door to the room suddenly burst open, cutting her off mid-sentence. A man entered, his face tense and his eyes scanning the room, quickly, like he was on high alert. He wore a dark suit, his expression unreadable, but something about him felt familiar. Emma froze, her eyes widening as she turned to look at him. "Who is that?" he asked, his heart racing. Emma didn't respond immediately. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she avoided his gaze. The man stepped forward, his eyes still locked on Emma, as though he were waiting for her to say something. "You're awake," the man said, his voice cold, his gaze hard. "Good. We need to talk." The presence of the mysterious man added to the already growing tension. Who was he? And why did Emma look so terrified at the sight of him? What had he come to tell them? The answers were just within reach, but the truth was still a few steps ahead, hiding in the shadows of their past. The air in the hospital room grew thick with tension as the man in the dark suit stepped forward. His cold eyes scanned the room, flicking between Emma and the patient in the bed, who now struggled to make sense of what was unfolding in front of him. The sudden arrival of this stranger, someone neither Emma nor he had expected, only deepened the mystery. Who was this man? And why was Emma so visibly shaken by his presence? Emma stood frozen, her hands clenched tightly by her sides, her breath shallow. She avoided his gaze, her back slightly turned as she seemed to gather herself. Her voice, when it came, was a quiet whisper. "How did you find us?" The man didn't answer immediately. His gaze lingered on Emma for a moment longer before he turned to the man in the bed. The millionaire, still trying to make sense of everything, felt an uneasy dread settling deep in his chest. He hadn't been in the room long, hadn't even been awake for a full day, and yet everything about this situation felt wrong. "Who are you?" The words came out more forcefully than he intended. His frustration with the growing mystery, the unanswered questions, and the strange emotions swirling in the air took over his voice. "And what's going on, Emma? What is this all about?" Emma, who had been on the verge of breaking down, now visibly stiffened at his words. She didn't look at him, but instead turned her attention to the man in the suit. The room was eerily quiet, save for the faint beeping of the heart monitor and the slight rustling of her clothing as she shifted uncomfortably. Finally, the man spoke. His voice was cold, deliberate, as though he had rehearsed these words 1,000 times. "My name is Marcus Jennings," he said, his tone even, "and I'm here to ensure that your situation doesn't spiral out of control. I've been watching over things, shall we say?" "Watching over things?" the millionaire echoed, incredulous. "What do you mean, watching over things? And who exactly are you working for?" Marcus glanced at Emma, his gaze lingering just a second longer than it needed to. Then he stepped closer to the bed. "You've been caught in something much bigger than you realize," he replied cryptically, "and I'm here to make sure you survive it." The words felt like a slap to the face. Survive it? What kind of situation had he woken up to? How had his life turned into something resembling a conspiracy? "Thriller? I don't understand," the millionaire said, trying to push himself up in bed, the effort almost making him wince in pain. "I don't even remember what happened. What situation? Why is everyone suddenly acting like I'm in danger?" Emma finally turned to look at him. Her eyes were filled with an overwhelming mix of fear and guilt. And when she spoke, her voice trembled. "It's not just you, not just the accident. It's everything, all of it. The people I—" Marcus raised a hand to silence her, and Emma obeyed, her lips pressing tightly together. She didn't protest, didn't argue. The unease in the air only grew stronger. "Your life wasn't just targeted because of the crash," Marcus continued, now looking directly at the millionaire. "It's been targeted for a long time, long before the accident." The millionaire's mind reeled. He couldn't remember much of his past, but something about Marcus's words clicked, something deep within him, something that felt right. But how? How could his life have been in danger for so long when he hadn't even realized it? Marcus seemed to read his thoughts. "The answers won't be easy to hear, but you need to understand that your past is coming for you. Those ghosts you've been trying to bury for years, they've risen, Emma finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "There are people who want you dead, people from your old business dealings, people you wronged. They're out for blood." The millionaire's heart raced. He knew his world had always been cutthroat, a maze of deals and backstabbing, but the thought that it could come to this, the thought that someone wanted him dead, was almost too much to bear. "Wait," he said, his mind racing. "Who are these people? What did I do?" Marcus walked over to the window, his back turned, seemingly lost in thought. He remained silent for a long time, as if contemplating whether or not to reveal the truth. Finally he spoke, his voice low, and laced with something darker than he had shown before. "They're people you crossed, people you took advantage of, old business partners, people who trusted you, people who thought you were untouchable." The millionaire's mind scrambled through every business transaction, every deal, every person he had worked with. But the truth was, he couldn't remember much of it. A life built on power, money, and ambition. And now it all seemed to be slipping away like grains of sand through his fingers. He had been ruthless, yes. He had made enemies along the way, but none that he had ever thought capable of taking his life. Had he truly been that naive? Was there a person from his past that he had wronged so severely that they would want him dead? "Marcus," he said finally, his voice trembling with frustration, "tell me what's really going on. Who are they? Who's behind all this?" Marcus turned from the window, his face impassive. "They're not one person," he said, his tone flat. "They're a network, a shadow group, and they've been watching you for years. They know everything about you, your weaknesses, your secrets." Emma spoke up then, her voice laced with sorrow. "You don't know how far this goes. You don't understand who you've hurt, who you've crossed." She looked at Marcus, her eyes pleading. "He doesn't remember everything, Marcus. He doesn't know what he did." Marcus's eyes softened for a moment before hardening again. He turned to face the millionaire, his eyes narrowing. "You'll remember soon enough," he said, "and when you do, you'll wish you never did." The silence that followed was suffocating. The weight of the situation pressed down on them like a vice. The millionaire could feel the walls of his own world closing in, everything he had known crumbling before his eyes. For the first time since waking up, he felt truly alone, isolated in a way he had never experienced before. And as he lay there, trapped in the confines of his hospital bed, he realized that his life wasn't just at risk. His very survival was now a battle for truth, a battle for answers. And as the mystery deepened, one thing became clear. The road to recovery wasn't just about his physical body. It was about confronting the dark truth of his past, a truth that would change everything. The days since Marcus's arrival felt like a descent into madness. The millionaire, whose identity had once been shaped by power, money, and endless success, was now a man on the run, trapped by the weight of his past and a memory that had become a fragile thread. The events surrounding the crash, the cryptic warnings from Emma and Marcus, and the shadows of his former life were closing in on him. His once vibrant world had turned dark and uncertain. Every time he closed his eyes, he was haunted by the faces he couldn't recall, the debts he hadn't remembered owing, and the mistakes he had no memory of making. But the thing that terrified him most wasn't just the threat of death. It was the fear of the truth, of what he might find out about himself. He lay there in the sterile hospital room, staring at the ceiling, barely aware of the beeping heart monitor and the faint rustling of nurses passing by. He hadn't left the room in days, confined by the walls of his own shattered reality. It felt as though the outside world had moved on without him, leaving him behind in this fragile state. Emma had been coming to visit, but her presence was no longer a comfort. She was distant now, her eyes filled with an unspoken regret every time they locked gazes. It was clear that whatever truth she had been keeping from him was still buried beneath layers of silence. And Marcus. Marcus seemed to know everything, but nothing about Marcus was clear. Every time the millionaire asked him more questions, Marcus would retreat into his cold, impassive demeanor, answering only in riddles. It was as if he held the key to everything, but he wasn't ready to unlock it yet. Today, however, things were different. Marcus had promised that he would take the millionaire somewhere that might provide the answers he so desperately needed. He had been silent about the details, but the promise of answers seemed to hang in the air like a tantalizing promise. The room door creaked open, and the figure of Marcus appeared. His dark suit still looked immaculate, his presence commanding and mysterious. He entered the room with the same unreadable expression, but there was a change in his demeanor, a quiet urgency. "Get dressed," Marcus said, his voice low, almost unreadable. "We're leaving," the millionaire blinked, confused. "Where are we going? You'll see," Marcus replied cryptically, stepping aside to allow him space to sit up. "We don't have time to waste. The longer you wait, the deeper you sink into this." The millionaire hesitated. His mind was still foggy from the trauma, and his body felt weak. But the thought of leaving the hospital, of taking a step toward the truth, pulled him from his stupor. He slowly pushed himself up from the bed, his muscles aching, the remnants of the coma still lingering in his body. But the desire to find answers, to confront the ghosts of his past, was stronger than any physical discomfort. He glanced at Emma, who was sitting by the window, her face turned away. She didn't look at him as he stood, her gaze lost in the distance. The guilt he saw in her eyes only fueled his determination. "Emma," he began, his voice catching in his throat. She turned to face him, her eyes brimming with sorrow. "I can't go with you. Not today. Not until you know everything." Her words were like a dagger to his heart. He wanted answers, but she was still keeping something from him. What had she done? What had she been involved in? She had promised she would stay, but now it felt as if she were pulling away, leaving him with even more unanswered questions. "Please, don't," he started, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "But there are things you're not ready to hear yet. I can't protect you anymore." She turned away, her voice distant. "Go, get the truth. Then you'll understand why I had to keep my distance." With that, she turned and left the room, leaving him standing there, feeling more isolated than ever. Marcus didn't wait for him to say another word. He led the millionaire down the sterile, whitewashed hallway of the hospital, past nurses and doctors who barely took notice of their departure. The millionaire had been in this hospital long enough to know that he was no longer a patient here. This was not the safe haven it had once been. Marcus guided him to an unmarked van parked outside the hospital entrance, its windows tinted dark. The millionaire glanced around, his senses heightened. He was being watched. He could feel it. But by whom? The doors to the van slid open with a soft hiss, and Marcus gestured for him to get inside. With a deep breath, the millionaire climbed into the van, his heart pounding in his chest. As the door closed behind him, the van pulled away from the curb, taking them deeper into the city's shadows. For the first time since the crash, he felt like he was moving closer to the truth. But what would that truth reveal? What had he done in his past to deserve this? He had always been ambitious, always been ruthless. But was it enough to warrant someone trying to take his life? As the van rolled through the city, past dimly lit streets and familiar landmarks, the millionaire tried to piece together the fragments of his past. But everything was shrouded in darkness. His memories, once clear and vivid, now seemed like fading echoes, elusive and incomplete. After what felt like an eternity, the van finally came to a stop. Marcus turned to him, his expression unreadable. "We're here," he said. The doors of the van opened, and the millionaire stepped out into the cold night air. He looked around, trying to make sense of where they had arrived. It was an industrial area, abandoned warehouses lining the streets, their windows boarded up and broken. The smell of rust and decay filled the air. Marcus led him into one of the buildings, the heavy door creaking as it opened. Inside, the space was vast, echoing with the sounds of their footsteps. The only light came from a single hanging bulb, casting long shadows on the concrete floor. "Why are we here?" the millionaire asked, his voice laced with anxiety. Marcus stopped in front of a metal door at the far end of the room. "Everything you've been searching for is behind that door." The millionaire's heart raced as he stepped forward, the anticipation growing with every step. What was behind that door? What secrets did it hold? His mind raced with 100 possibilities, but he had no idea how far the truth would go. Marcus opened the door with a low click, and the millionaire stepped into the room. Inside, he found rows of old files, boxes stacked high, and a computer screen that flickered to life as they entered. But it wasn't the files or the equipment that caught his attention. It was the figure sitting at the desk, a figure he knew all too well. The figure sitting at the desk was a ghost from the past. The millionaire's heart seemed to stop as he stepped into the dimly lit room and locked eyes with the man sitting before him, his hands instinctively clenched into fists, a wave of disbelief washing over him. "Jacob," he whispered, the name barely escaping his lips. The man at the desk, Jacob, his old business partner, the one he thought he had left behind, looked up slowly, a slow smile creeping onto his face as recognition flickered in his eyes. You're alive," the millionaire said, his voice shaking. His thoughts were racing, trying to piece together the impossible sight before him. The last time he had seen Jacob was years ago. They had parted ways on bad terms after a failed deal, and he had assumed Jacob was gone from his life forever. But now here he was, sitting in front of him, the man who had once been his closest ally, now turned something else entirely, something darker. "Of course I'm alive," Jacob replied, his voice smooth, almost too calm. "You didn't think I'd let you get away that easily, did you?" The millionaire took a step back, his mind reeling. His thoughts began to collide, memories and fragments of conversations with Jacob surfacing, but they didn't make sense. He had no idea that Jacob would go to these lengths. "What happened, Jacob?" he demanded, his voice gaining strength. "What is all of this? Why would you try to kill me?" Jacob's smile widened, though his eyes remained cold. "It's not just about you," he said, leaning back in his chair, his fingers steepling together. "It's about everything we built, the empire we created. You've forgotten everything, haven't you? You've wiped it all from your memory, buried it deep down. But I remember everything." The millionaire's chest tightened. Buried it down? He hadn't even realized how much he had forgotten until now. Pieces of his life, pieces of his business dealings were beginning to come back to him, but they were all disjointed. He couldn't see the full picture. "You were always so focused on the bigger picture," Jacob continued, his voice filled with bitter amusement. "On making money, on climbing higher, but you were blind to everything around you. You didn't see the consequences of the deals we made, the people we betrayed, the risks we took, and now here we are." The millionaire's mind was spinning. He couldn't focus on the words Jacob was saying. What was he talking about? "I didn't betray anyone," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I did what was necessary to keep the business going. You know that." Jacob shook his head slowly, a dark chuckle escaping his lips. "No, you didn't just do what was necessary. You took everything. You left nothing for anyone else. And I've been watching you ever since. You think this crash, this coma, was an accident? It wasn't. It was the final piece in a long game that's been unfolding for years." The millionaire felt a chill run down his spine. The pieces were starting to click into place, but the picture that was forming in his mind was far darker than he had anticipated. The crash wasn't random. It wasn't just a near-fatal accident. It was an orchestrated event, a carefully planned move to remove him from the game once and for all. "You set me up," the millionaire said, his voice a whisper of disbelief. "You had me in your sights all along." Jacob's smile deepened, his expression cold. "You were never meant to survive," he said simply. "I knew that if I didn't finish what we started, you'd come back stronger, trying to reclaim what you thought was yours. So I took matters into my own hands." Everything the millionaire had known, the empire he had built, the ambition that had driven him to the top, suddenly felt meaningless. His past wasn't a series of strategic moves or calculated risks. It was a trail of destruction, betrayal, and lies. "But why?" the millionaire asked, his voice thick with confusion. "Why now? Why wait all these years? Why not do it sooner?" Jacob's eyes darkened, and for a moment he seemed to look past the millionaire, lost in his thoughts. "Because I needed time," he said finally. "Time to build something that would ensure I'd win. Time to build connections, alliances, and the kind of power you never had. You were always too short-sighted. You never saw the bigger picture, like I did, and now it's too late for you." The millionaire's mind was racing. He had spent so many years focused on expanding his wealth, climbing higher and higher in the business world, that he had missed everything happening in the shadows. He had trusted Jacob, and Jacob had used that trust to destroy him. "You think this is over?" the millionaire said, his voice suddenly growing steadier. "You think you've won?" Jacob didn't answer immediately. He just continued to stare at him, the coldness in his eyes never wavering. Finally he spoke. "It's already over. You've already lost. The game is done. I've already taken what I needed from you." The millionaire stood there for a long moment, the weight of Jacob's words sinking in. There was no escaping it. His entire life, everything he had worked for, had been a lie. Jacob had orchestrated this, everything, the accident, the coma, his fall from grace. And now he was left with nothing, but one thing lingered in the millionaire's mind. What about Emma? Suddenly his eyes widened. Emma had known. His thoughts flashed back to their last conversation, to the way she had looked at him when she said, "There are things you're not ready to hear." She had been part of this, too. She had been keeping secrets, just like Jacob. Had she been complicit in this from the beginning? Or had she been a victim, caught in Jacob's web, just like him? "Where is she?" he asked, his voice rough. Jacob's expression faltered for a moment, a flicker of something dark passing through his eyes. "She's gone," he said flatly. "You won't find her." The words hit him like a blow. Emma, the woman who had stood by his side, the one who had pulled him from the wreckage, she had disappeared. And now there was no trace of her. The millionaire's mind swirled. He had to find her. He had to get answers, to understand what had happened. He couldn't let her slip away without knowing the truth. He turned to Marcus, who had been standing silently by the door, watching the exchange with an unreadable expression. "Where is she?" he demanded. Marcus hesitated, then stepped forward. "We don't know, but you need to focus on one thing right now. You're not out of danger yet. Jacob might think it's over, but the truth is, the game is far from finished." Millionaire stood in stunned silence, trying to process everything. His entire life had been manipulated, twisted, and broken, but there was still a flicker of hope left inside him. "I'm not finished," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Not yet. The end."